Yes, good morning. Today is December the 10th. It is Thursday. Tomorrow you have your Mastery Connect over the age of science and reason, the Enlightenment. So tune in for that. But today let's finish up with the American Revolution, which we started talking about yesterday, um, which is, to be honest, I'm all for the cause of loving this country. Really, really, trust me. But at the same time, I think we'll never be able to really love this country until we try to be as accurate as possible when we talk about our own history. We need to say that, just admit the fact that our country's history is made up of individuals, and individuals have flaws. And these individuals have done things that are great and should be admired. And they've also done things that, um, you know, shows that they are not perfect. Um, and we're not going to talk about statues right now. Although I was just interested that at the Virginia Military Institute, VMI, yesterday took down the statue of one of its founding fathers, Stonewall Jackson. Uh, you know, they're going to put Stonewall Jackson in a museum, and it's being done in an orderly process, and so that's good. Uh, but I'm not in favor of tearing down, defacing statues and things of that nature. That's just not right, and it's not what a civilized society does. A civilized society petitions and does things in an orderly manner. Uh, you know, and there's not a human being that's ever lived in American history whose record is spotless. You know, even the greatest of the great moral leaders of this country have a checkered past. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, to quote the Apostle Paul. So, back to the matter at hand. Forgive me for rambling. Let's begin, shall we? Talking about the beginnings of the cause of the American Revolution. We went over two of them yesterday, the influxment of Enlightenment ideas. Yes, remember, every one of the colonial, and I talked about this yesterday, or Tuesday, every one of the colonial um, colonies had a colonial legislature, and a legislature based on the Parliament, based on the ideas of the Enlightenment, based on checks and balances. Thank you, the Baron de Montesquieu and John Locke. But once again, here's the big one, and I talked about that yesterday. In fact, I talked about all of this. Let's go on, shall we? Here's where we are. I want to finish today. What issues were left over from the French and Indian War? One, the debt. Uh, there was a tremendous amount of debt the British government had incurred in fighting and winning the French and Indian War. And the British wanted to increase the amount of income, which meant taxation, and which once again meant enforcing laws that were already on the book, even though they were mercantilist laws. And number two, the British government was also about saving money. And that saving money, right here, um, was about expanding in past the Appalachians. You see, as more colonials poured into the 13 colonies, land became an issue. The available land became an issue, and the poor could not afford to buy land. And of course, from their perspective, across the Appalachians, thank you, Daniel Boone, there were a seemingly unlimited supply of land. The problem was that was Native American land. And the Native Americans weren't just going to sit back and allow these colonial invaders to come and, put down roots and build farms and hunt the game and basically push them out, not without a fight. Well, they would need to be protected. But the British said, if we protect them, if we put soldiers over there, that will cost money, which they did not want to spend. And so they the British government said no more expansion past the Appalachians. Oh, yes. And then they passed several acts, the Stamp Act, which, really is an overblown, uh, what you call, I call overblown truths about the American Revolution. There was a Stamp Act. It was a tax, but it wasn't the thing that was tearing the country apart like your history books claim it was. And I don't want to go into a long, complicated explanation, but I'll just say this. In the Stamp Act, the only items affected were um, printed materials and legal documents. Who's affected by that? Well, the answer is newspapers and attorneys, who are two of the have most vocal segments of any civilization, the press and lawyers, and of course when they made the noise, they left records. And anyway, Sons of Liberty. Now, Sons of Liberty, I'm sure you read about in your grade school social studies books and portraying them as some kind of heroes. I'm going to tell you what, if the Sons of Liberty were around today, they would be on the 10 most wanted list. Sons of Liberty committed acts of terror. They did ambush British tax collectors, cover them with tar and feathers, lynch many of them, etc., etc., etc. And yes, they're responsible for the Boston Tea Party, which is mentioned down there later. And so, yeah. And these committees of correspondence, they were people who kept communications open amongst the colonies and exchanged information, particularly information about British troop movements and ways to cooperate. Yeah, and the claim of taxation without representation, here's the thing. The average colonial living in the 13 colonies had better representation in Parliament than the average British working person living in London. London, the entire city of London, which by this time had 1 million people, had one representative in Parliament who really didn't represent their interest. He represented moneyed interest. All 13 colonies did have one representative in Parliament. And, so when it says no taxation without representation, that's not exactly true. Not a real complaint. And yes, the Boston Tea Party, a bunch of those so-called Sons of Liberty, dressed up as Native Americans, went down to the harbor and tossed 242 chests of tea, British East India Company tea, into the harbor, of course, ruining the tea, and a cost of like $400,000. And yeah, and in response to that, the British government passed the Intolerable Acts. Acts which, they were called the Intolerable Acts by the American press. They were severe. For example, they closed Boston Harbor. For example, they shut down the Massachusetts legislature. For example, they stationed British soldiers in Boston, imposing martial law. Yeah, basically what that means is that in this confrontation between 13 colonies and the British government, push was coming to shove, shove was coming to punch, punch was coming to, yeah, Minutemen, the Minutemen were basically the first National Guard, really. They were these people who they armed themselves and they were supposed to be ready to go fight at a minute's notice. But Paul Revere, now that's interesting. You see, the Minutemen set up a early warning system, which was the idea that, the warning system was the Old North Church in Boston. When British soldiers marched or were going out to search for weapons, they would have a guy go up there and hold up one lantern if the British soldiers were marching by land, two if they were going to march by sea, and there was one that night. And Paul Revere was one of the people who was supposed to go out and warn the countryside. And yeah, the Midnight Rider, Paul Revere. Here's what's odd about that. There were actually two riders, Paul Revere and a guy named William Dawes, Dawes. And they both went out. And actually, Paul Revere's circuit, his ride, very short. The person that did most of the riding and most of the warning and most of the risking of his own life was this guy, William Dawes. And so, why have you never heard of him? Well, I'll tell you why. Let me see if I can remember how it goes. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of William Dawes. And you go thud. And that's why. See, Revere rhymes with here. And that's why he was immortalized. Actually, Paul Revere spent most of the rest of the war in disgrace as a deserter. It was only until William Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem about the Midnight Ride that, Revere becomes immortalized. So, why did the 13 colonies prevail in the American Revolution? To be real honest, the 13 colonies did not prevail. The British just gave up in the story. I mean, yeah, they won battles here and there, just like the Vietnamese, as it says there, won battles against the Americans in the Vietnam War. But George Washington and Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam knew the same thing, and that was this, that for the 13 colonies to win in the American Revolution, and for the Vietnamese to win in the Vietnam War, they both had to do the same thing, and that was just hold on, make the war last, continue to be viable, and continue to cost the invader money and soldiers, and eventually they'll quit. And in both cases, they did. All right, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? Well, I guess we have to say Thomas Jefferson plagiarized the Declaration of Independence. Remember John Locke's words? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable, or actually Locke says natural rights, that chiefly amongst these are life, liberty, and property. Well, yeah, Jefferson took that and said, I'm not plagiarizing. I'm not using their exact words. Where have I heard that before? So, George Washington. George Washington, once again, father of our country. George Washington, he was a brave man in the extent that he put his life on the line, and of course the lives of 20,000 men on the line. George Washington, he showed courage. He held together in the face of overwhelming odds. But was he a great general? No. He spent most of the war running. And so I guess you could call him a great general because he kept his army together. I mean, for example, the first major engagement George Washington faced was the Battle of Long Island. He was given 20,000 men in the summer of 1776, and he took those 20,000 men and put them on an island to face the British with the world's best navy and one of the world's best armies. And the bad thing about putting yourself on an island is that if things go badly, which they did, you don't have a retreat. You don't have a back door. And they did go bad. And in fact, the Battle of Long Island, and Long Island, by the way, is just below New York City. And things did go badly. And George Washington was saved by two things. Number one, dumb weather luck. When Washington finally began to retreat, what kept the British from hunting him down and killing him was a terrible fog. A fog that enveloped the entire island and the entire sun. The British couldn't see them. They couldn't see 5 feet in front of their face. And the other thing that saved George Washington was one of his officers was a guy named Colonel John Glover. And Glover was a Marblehead, Massachusetts fisherman who led a regiment of Marble, Massachusetts fishermen. And what this guy did, he went up and down Long Island Sound, the area between the island of Long Island and New York State, and he stole every boat that was available and loaded Washington soldiers on the boats, rowed them across the Sound, and got them on dry land. And then George Washington begins what he does the whole war. And the answer is running. In fact, he kept running. Now remember, he began with 20,000 men, and that was in September of August of 1776. And by December of 1776, his army is down to 2,000 men, of which about 1,500 were fit to fight. And the British chased him all across New York, down into New Jersey, and across the Delaware River. And once again, Glover saved him. He got all the boats on the Delaware River, kept them from the British, got Washington across the Delaware, and the river was between the British and George Washington. But George Washington knew two things. Number one, that river was going to freeze over because back then they lived during the Little Ice Age, and yeah, the river was going to freeze. And the German Hessians were going to walk right over and destroy what was left of George Washington's army. And number two, if he didn't win some kind of victory soon, his army was going to disappear. I mean, they were already deserting in droves, and so he had to do something quick. And here is where George Washington was his most brilliant, and it was the Battle of Trenton. And for those of you who know, the Battle of Trenton was won by George Washington and the Continental Army, because they attacked the Hessians at Trenton on Christmas Day. Why is that so important? Because the Hessians, like all good Germans, on Christmas Eve got really, 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 really drunk, and were really, really, really hungover the next morning. And so, yeah, that saved the army, really. Never again will the army approach utter decimation as it did that first year. Although to me, George Washington's greatest moment was Valley Forge. Valley Forge was the winter of 1777, when what was left of his army had to be stationed in Valley Forge, which is a small town outside of Philadelphia. The British were stationed in Philadelphia in warm beds, and George Washington's army was literally freezing and starving to death. And it was during this time that he makes the army into an army. How does he do that? He gets help. Two foreigners, Baron von Steuben from Prussia and a Count Kosciuszko from Poland, trained the colonials into a real regular army. But the turning point of the war was here at Saratoga. Saratoga is in upstate New York, and at Saratoga, General Nathaniel Greene, one of Washington's generals who didn't like Washington, actually surrounds and captures a British army led by gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. And that victory, A, convinced the French that the Americans had a chance, and B, convinced them to give the Americans 20 million livres. 20 million livres. And remember that amount, 20 million livres. And that amount is going to bankrupt the French government. Yeah, the American Revolution bankrupts the French government, causes the French Revolution. Say again, the American Revolution bankrupts the French government, causing the French Revolution. And so, yeah, Battle of Cowpens, that was the greatest American victory. Thank you. That was the battle you just saw on where Mel Gibson saves the American Revolution. That's Cowpens. There was a Cowpens, and the character Mel Gibson was supposed to represent was actually a guy named Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. And if you ever watch the movie The Patriot, note that Mel Gibson's crew spends a lot of time in the South Carolina swamps, which is what Francis Marion did, harassing British shipping, harassing British troop movements, those kind of things. And finally, Washington feints a move to New York and then heads down to Virginia and surrounds General Cornwallis along with the army from South Carolina and Mel Gibson. And yeah, they surround the British at Yorktown. The French come in and cut them off in the sea, and the British surrendered. And that was 1781, and that marked the end of the American Revolution. The victory of the American Revolution created a new Republican form of government. Now, the first attempt at the United States to form a self-government was this thing called the Articles Confederation. It was an idea that they tried to come up with, but the worst thing about the Articles Confederation, for it to do anything, all 13 colonies or states, all 13 states had to agree to it. Totally impossible. In fact, the only thing the Articles of Confederation ever did was to pass the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which provided a way that territories could become states. And that was it. I mean, other than that, I mean, it was totally useless. And then the founding fathers went and cheated, and I do say cheated. They basically changed the government over to the Constitution. What do you mean cheated? Well, once again, the Articles of Confederation says any change in government has to be approved by all 13 states. They knew they would never get that approval, and so instead they said, all right, we'll just use the rules of the Constitution to make the Constitution. And as you know, the Constitution can be changed with a 3/4 majority, or 9 of the 13 states, which created a federal system. A federal system provides that the national government is stronger, has more authority than any state or all of the states. Yeah, checks and balances, you all know what that means. It means that the president can act and make decisions independently, but he can be impeached, and the Supreme Court interprets the law. Well, it means that the legislature makes the law, the Supreme Court interprets the law, and what's the other guy? The president enforces the law. Sometimes that gets bogged down in the details. But the Constitution would not have been passed without the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, which all deal with individual liberties. And I've got to quit because we're done, and I've got to go to my class. Okay? Good luck on your test tomorrow. I will see you on Thursday.